Good morning. Hello, world history. Sorry I'm not in class today. I'm out at a meeting all day, but I hope your quiz went really well. Today we're starting Unit 2, Topic 2. So this video is a little introduction to this new topic to get you started studying Rome. Due today was the Alexander versus Chin Historical Argument Planner. Hopefully that went well. Hopefully it was a good studying tool. We will spend some time throughout the week working on that argument and drafting a really good thesis statement so you get Essay 2 off to a really good start. You do have a little bit more homework tonight, but hopefully you have time in class to go ahead and get started on that. You're going to complete some guided notes on pages 21 and 22 of your workbook. And for the first time, we're actually going to be reading a section from the World History textbook. I'll show you at the end of class or at the end of this video how to access that textbook reading. All right, so for now, press pause if you need to, but grab your workbooks and turn to page 19. We're going to do a little bit of guided notes together before you're off and running with the textbook reading on a similar topic. So go ahead and do that and then return to this video if you need to. Okay, before we start jotting a few things down on page 19, I want to give you a little overview on this topic and the transition from Unit 2, Topic 1 about empire builders to Unit 2, Topic 2 about Rome. So we just finished off Topic 1 where we were comparing how Alexander the Great and Emperor Qin built these empires, this new model of a civilization. And we looked at their accomplishments and we compared their accomplishments to one another. For the remainder of Unit 2, we'll be doing sort of the same thing, but with the two successor empires to Alexander's empire and Emperor Qin. So we're going to be looking at the Roman Empire, which here's a map of the Roman Empire at its largest extent. You can see it covers some of the same territory as Alexander the Great's empire, with a little bit more focus on looking west to the Mediterranean Sea. And then the successor empire to the Qin Empire is the Han Empire, or the next ruling dynasty, the Han Dynasty, which, as you can see, comparing these maps, covers a bit of the same geographic territory. Both of these empires were larger and more complex than Alexander and Qin's empires were, but they share a lot of the same accomplishments, which of course we're going to compare to each other. So that's why we're starting this new empire, Rome. If we were to look at a map in the year 1 of the current calendar that we use, here's the Roman Empire in the west at its furthest extent, and here's the Han Empire in the east at its furthest extent. The two never actually met and didn't really know about each other until their final years before their decline. But they both came into existence for very different reasons. And we've got to do a little bit more legwork with the Roman Empire to understand why. As we know, Alexander's empire, when he dies, breaks up into 4 different empires. So the Roman Empire is, in and of itself, its own political entity. And in order to trace its origins, we have to go to the city of Rome in the Italian peninsula and look at what the city was like long before it was an empire, when it was just a city-state. So that's where we're going to begin. All right, so we can continue with some geography and label the map at the top of page 19. Of course, geography always tells us a lot about how empires are formed and the shape that they take through territorial conquest. So like I mentioned, the Roman Empire begins in this city-state of Rome, the same exact location as the present-day city of Rome and the capital of the country of Italy. This line on the map represents Rome at its furthest extent. Your reading that you complete tonight will talk you through how it reached this furthest extent, or at least started to expand from a city-state to an empire. There's a few geographic features we should point out. One, we already noted that the expansion of Rome is really around the Mediterranean Sea. That was in the middle of what becomes its empire. And in the west, we mentioned Italian peninsula. In the west, they wanted to expand all the way from one entry point of the Mediterranean, which is the Strait of Gibraltar, the very narrow strip of water between the Iberian Peninsula and the continent of Africa. And in the east, another very tiny strip of water, another strait called the Bosporus Strait, which separates the Mediterranean Sea from the Black Sea. So those become sort of the western and eastern bookends of the empire. And as the empire expands, they want to conquer other cities city-states in the region. So you'll be reading about how Rome conquered a rival city-state, Carthage, in the Punic Wars to gain control of the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, somewhat limiting the expansion of Rome in the continent of Europe are mountain ranges like the Alps, although they do end up occupying most of this territory north of the Alps. And to the south, blocking any further expansion of Rome southward is the Sahara Desert, which was just this dry land with really no value to Rome at all. So that sort of explains the furthest extent of the Roman Empire. But before we look at Rome as an empire, we first have to understand Rome, the city-state. So quickly, let's review the core periphery model. So last week, we talked about this model of how empires generally get built or how they form. And step one was that a rich core area forms. And this is going to be the city-state of Rome, this urban core center that becomes a very thriving trading center in the Mediterranean on the Italian peninsula. The second step is that this thriving core starts to gain control of surrounding periphery regions for resources. So as the core becomes wealthier, it tends to move beyond farming and then rely on the outskirts to provide its key resources. Step 3 is when the core develops ways to manage and exploit the periphery, and it starts to form semi-peripheries, and it starts to formalize its control over the surrounding periphery through territorial conquest. This is exactly the step that you're going to read about in the textbook tonight. And then finally, step 4 is that the core and the semi-peripheries and the peripheries all become one integrated system dependent on each other, and hopefully the empire has formed strong enough complex institutions and used culture wisely in order to truly unify the empire to prevent revolt. So that'll be our next step in studying Rome. So essentially we get the core, which is the city-state of Rome, and then it begins to conquer the periphery. These are the topics you'll read about tonight: Rome's expansion into the Italian peninsula and the Punic Wars, where they conquer the city-state of Carthage. So let's talk a little bit about how Rome as a city-state became a thriving urban center. Let's first talk about their society. And I know you don't have a lot of room on page 19 to write all this down, but try your best to squeeze it all in. The key idea we want to understand about Roman society is that the form of government that they established in Rome, which was a republic, we'll define that in a moment, it was designed to represent all citizens in a social hierarchy. So this is the second time in world history that we're looking at a political system and a society that defines some people as citizens, but not all people. To be a citizen in Rome was defined slightly different than in Athens. You might remember that in ancient Athens, that democracy, citizens were wealthy, land-owning males that were born in Athens. Well, in Rome, there were two tiers of citizens, and the first were called patricians. These were the wealthy landowners that inherited their wealth and their power, and they were the sole group of citizens with the ability to make laws in the Roman Republic. However, there was a second tier of citizenship, and these people were called plebeians. These are the majority of people in the Roman city-state. They're common people, laborers, small farmers that are citizens, but they are limited in their political rights. And we're going to talk more about that on the next slide. There were slaves in Rome. Remember, this is really typical of all places around the world in ancient times, that there were non-free laborers that were bought and sold by citizens that have zero political rights at all. So this was the Roman social structure. So let's see how that corresponds to the political structure in this form of government known as a republic. Let's first define what a republic is. It's the same form of government that we have in the United States, the form of government in which power rests with citizens who have the right to vote for their leaders. So as opposed to a democracy where citizens directly vote for laws, in a republic, citizens elect leaders or representatives to make the laws for them. And this system of leadership in the Roman Republic is called the cursus honorum, and it's a multi-tiered system as well. So at the very tip top of the cursus honorum were two consuls, or king-like figures, that commanded the army and directed the government for a one-year term. Their powers are really comparable to the executive branch or the president of the United States today, who's also commander-in-chief of the army and gets to approve of laws, but doesn't make the law. The lawmakers, just like in the United States, were a Senate, or we now have the Senate and the House of Representatives. But in ancient Rome, in the Republic, they had a 300-member Senate, and only patricians or aristocrats, landowners, could become members of the Senate. And they had legislative functions, so they made laws after debating them and then voting on them. There was another tier of representatives in the Roman Republic, and this other tier are the tribunes. They represented the voice of the people, or the voice of the plebeians. So they could sit in the Senate and listen to them debate and make laws, but they could not actually vote on the laws. The only power they had was to speak on behalf of laws, or to speak for reasons they shouldn't adopt laws, and then they could also veto laws that the Senate made. And finally, this will become important as we look at the fall of the Roman Republic. The Constitution of the Roman Republic allowed for a dictator in the time of an emergency. So if there was a crisis, there would be a dictator that could take power for a 6-month term only. And this was for the purpose of being able to deal with crisis very, very fast. If there was an emergency, laws and decisions needed to be made quickly. And the normal functioning of the Republic, just like our own government, is designed to work really, really slowly as senators and tribunes debate laws over and over again until they reach a consensus. So in a time of an emergency, they could have a dictator for 6 months to help them make quick decisions and end the emergency as soon as possible. This chart is a good little comparison between how our system of checks and balances in our republic works. At the top, the balance between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, which you've all learned about, and how that compares to the Roman Republican system. So as opposed to trying to balance the powers and functions of government, the Roman Republic tried to balance the various interests of social groups, especially between the aristocratic Senate and the more democratic tribunes that represented the people. We're actually going to simulate or do a debate within the Roman Senate for this topic, so you'll see more closely how this system worked. And finally, let's talk about the culture of this core, the Roman Republic. It was a very politically active culture, and citizens, both plebeians and patricians, had a very strong sense of civic duty. And there's 2 reasons for this. One, every male citizen, patrician and plebeian, was expected to be a citizen soldier. Anytime the Roman city-state or growing empire needed to go to war, all men were expected to serve. And so this got them very interested in approving wars or getting interested in passing laws because it impacted them directly. The other concept that's important is called paterfamilias, and that literally is just a Latin term, a Roman language term for the father of the family. And the father of the family was seen as sort of the head political figure of the family. The family was considered a sort of a small government system with the father as the head of the government. And so they expanded this idea out to their whole society, which supported republicanism. Anywhere you go, even in Rome today, you see this phrase SPQR. And the translation of this is a Latin phrase, Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. So everyday people felt very connected to their government. One way that this plays out in shaping Roman culture in an everyday sort of way is that education in Rome was really widespread. So they practiced a system of education that was based on the Greek model, so they called it Greco-Roman liberal arts, where all children of citizens were expected to be educated, and expected to be educated in a very well-rounded set of subjects, anywhere from rhetoric and philosophy and history to the maths and the sciences. And all children, both male and female, were educated and expected to go to school. This is one way that the core center of Rome has a higher standard of living and becomes much more wealthier and skilled than the surrounding periphery areas. So that's going to lead to a lot of inequality between the core and the periphery. So now let's talk a little bit about what you're going to read in your textbook, which is the Punic Wars. This map shows you this expansion of Rome from a city-state to conquering some of the Italian peninsula, to conquering some of the northern border of the Mediterranean Sea. And what you're going to read about is the conquest of this southern border when the city-state of Rome goes to war with the city-state of Carthage. Not only does this start to transform Rome from a city-state republic to an empire, but it starts to bring about some severe social challenges that make it very difficult to retain a republican form of government while acting more and more like an empire. So that's what we really want to find out from your reading tonight, is how did Rome go about conquering and becoming an empire, but also how did that process strain its political system and strain its society and its values? So here are your next steps. Go ahead and get started on your homework tonight. Complete the guided notes on pages 21 and 22 of your workbook. And like I mentioned, you're going to use the textbook chapter that's posted on Canvas. Just head to the calendar on our homepage, find our date, October 2nd, and you'll see a link there to the textbook chapter. If you do have time in class, if you're done with that, you could always continue to work on your Alexander versus Chin essay. Open up a new Google Doc and get started. One other thing that I want to point out about your homework is when you open up the chapter on Canvas, it's going to give you the entire chapter, chapter 6 from the textbook about Rome. You don't want to start from the beginning. Make sure you're starting on page 155, which is right here. Rome spreads its power. So you don't need to read the entire chapter, just the textbook pages at the top of pages 21 and 22. Okay, see you in class tomorrow to discuss your homework, to discuss more about your essay, and to learn more about how Rome became an empire.